So a diversity, diversity in the food system, that is the title of our session, and we have four very various members of panels who have very differing viewpoints. They have their own perspective of what diversity within the food chain means to them. Before I introduce them, my name is Prysor. I'm a lecturer in environmental management in the natural sciences department at Bangor University. I have an interest in research fields that bridge the environments and agriculture. That's enough about me. Those who you really want to hear more about are, of course, our panelists. So I'll just introduce them very quickly. We have Glenda, Non, Olwen and Teleri. I'll say a little more about each panelist as they come forward to speak. And Glenda will start off this morning. Glenda has been working in the agri-environmental sector for a number of years. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with Glenda and her peers through their consultation work via FWAG Cymru. FWAG Cymru has existed for some 8 years now, but Glenda worked for FWAG when it was an all-Britain body. FWAG provides very sage advice, very intelligent advice on all aspects of conservational management on farms, the length and breadth of the country, from the lowland farms to the upland farms, and essentially FWAG forms a strong bridge between production and conservation and nature, and reducing the impact of climate change, rather than thinking of production on the one hand and the environment on the other. FWAG brings both together. They have 5 permanent staff members, but they draw on other staff members occasionally, and I'm sure that FWAG will be very busy over the coming years as the agricultural, agri-farming schemes evolve through the Welsh Government. So with those very few words, Glenda, if I may ask you first of all to come forward and to share with us your screen. Thank you, Prysor. Thank you for that word of welcome. I presume everybody can hear me and everybody can see the screen. Okay. So diversity. When I heard the topic of the topic, I was just wondering what on earth I can do with this in 10 minutes time, but thank goodness the focus is going to be on farming and biodiversity on farms. And first of all, I wanted to talk about, well, I don't know how many times I hear people talking about farmers and just generalizing really about farmers as a homogeneous group. And I don't know how on earth this is possible, because as with any group of farmers, there is such diversity there, and there's a diversity of opinions, the way in which they work, everything, perhaps more than any other sector, because they are unique businesses in themselves. They are used to working independently. There's a huge diversity within the group itself. And of course, we are also talking about food production. We have very intensive farmers in Wales. For example, here, we have these jerseys that are kept indoors throughout the year. And then you have another example where these Welsh black cattle are out throughout the year most of the time. Sometimes they are kept indoors. And then, as Prysor indicated, we want to celebrate the fact that intensive farming, indeed any type of farming, can coexist with excellent environmental management. I'm just giving you a few examples here. In the lowlands, where you have such diversity of flowers and traditional grasslands, and in the uplands you have bracken mountains. You have keepers taking care of this area, burning the bracken in order to try and help the grouse, and of course in so doing many other species benefit from this. Water features, I think this is becoming ever more important, that farmers take care of the entire biodiversity in these areas to ensure good water quality. That final slide, that is in the uplands, of course, and in the lowlands, you have this river running through very important landscape in terms of conservation, and they also support them. And this biodiversity needs to be protected, as David McCracken's indicated. We need to make sure that farmers with this existing conservation work are supported. And also, how many times do I hear things such as, years ago I'd hear this bird, or years ago I would see these species. Not many farmers can say that they are on their farms, yet alone that they are nesting and raising their chicks. So there's something that we have to do differently. There are some species that are increasing in numbers, but many others are dwindling in numbers. There's been much mention in the previous discussion, if you like, about these two camps. I remember last year in this conference, I was trying to focus on the fact that there should not be two camps. Who on earth took out conservation from farming? I don't think it was the farmers who decided this. And what I'd like to see is the farmer himself assuming responsibility for this next plan, the next farm management plan that will form part of the new plan. I'm showing you this screen now because this is traditional grassland. You'll see bluebells there. You have bitter wood wedge here also, which is quite scarce. I suspect that the person knows how to take care of this and make sure that this continues for prosperity, and that is the farmer. And thus far, with all the plans that I've been involved with, the government has not passed on that responsibility to the farmer, and I hope this will be the case. And of course, the farmer, in my opinion, needs to assume this responsibility. They can do this, and of course there is significant support out there. If farmers need help or indeed guidance in terms of how to implement this plan, and I think that is the main message as we move forward. And one of the reasons also, as indicated in our previous discussion, is the fact that farmers have the stock there already, which is vital in terms of managing these habitats. We must have sheep on our mountains if we want to retain our habitats. We need to have the cattle on boggy land. If the cattle are there, then there will always be biodiversity. And of course, moving forward into the future with this new plan, the government has already embarked on this journey by listening more to farmers, and they've started to think of the projects that would benefit biodiversity. This happens through the Nature Fund with the SMS, Sustainable Management Scheme. Now we are working with a Panel partnership 2050, where we have a group of farmers planning the future for that area. I think this is vital. How am I doing for time, Prysor? Yes, I think perhaps you can conclude now. That is the message that I would like to convey, which is to give responsibility to farmers. They know best what they have on their farms. They know much more about biodiversity and historical sites and so forth on their farms, much more so than anyone would like to give them credit for. Now, they just need to be given the confidence and the responsibility, and off they go. Well, there we are. That is a very positive message to finish with. Off you go. And a very excellent picture to finish with. So thank you. Very interesting. A number of very timely points you make there at a time when plans as we know them are coming to an end, and the future, well, it's almost a clean slate. Now there's an opportunity now to create better plans, and I hope that is the direction that we are taking. So we'll have an opportunity to pick up a number of points in the questions at the end. So thank you, Glenda. Though we like the picture, can you please now stop sharing the screen? Next, we have Non. Non is a Redby Technical Officer for North Wales on behalf of Mentor Business, who started in her post at the beginning of September. So quite recently, prior to that, Non was a PhD student with us at the Natural Sciences School in Bangor, and I'm very happy to say that Non has now completed her PhD yesterday, as it happens. So congratulations to Non on behalf of everybody in the session this morning. And of course, for Non's PhD, she studied different systems of grazing in the uplands, and in addition to her work, she's very busy outside her normal working hours. She's been very busy with the Young Farmers Movement for a number of years. She's been chair of the Anglesey CYFFC in 2018-19. Also, she's been chair of the Rural Affairs Subcommittee across Wales until very, very recently. Non, with those very few words, over to you. Thank you, Prysor, for the welcome, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel today. I have no slides to share with you, so you'll have to listen to me just for a while. I'm going to start in a similar vein to Glenda, and as Glenda mentioned, in just thinking of a topic for today's session, diversity, I was thinking to myself, where on earth does one begin, really? There is no doubt that this is a topic that can be discussed all day in the context of the food chain. But having thought about it in more detail for my personal contribution today, I'm going to focus very briefly on our agricultural systems here in Wales, but specifically our grasslands in the context of livestock systems, because as Prysor has already indicated, this was very much the focal point of my PhD research. So, in thinking about our agricultural systems here in Wales, I think it's fair to say that they're very much influenced by the landscape and its features in a way, including the height, the altitude of the land, climate, and so forth. So there are a number of different features to consider when we're discussing our agricultural systems. And of course, in the context of diversity, I think it's fair to say that diversity exists within agricultural systems in here in Wales, in addition to between systems. And I think this is when things become a little complex in a way, because we have so much diversity within our systems, in addition to between farming systems. And I think that this diversity stems from a number of different cases, as I've indicated. It stems from a number of different features, but also as a result of the purpose of the land, the use or purpose of the land when we consider constraints or specific regulations on specific pieces of land. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to briefly focus on grassland for a couple of minutes. And in thinking about soils, we are very aware that nature and the physical features of soils vary from area to area, though Wales is a relatively small country. We have this broad diversity in this country in terms of structure. These are all factors that work together, but they impact the way in which we can contribute to this food system here in Wales. And this, of course, means that farmers face challenges in terms of land management within their systems, the challenges for, of course, bad design, these physical factors. One example here in Wales, we have a lot of mountainous land and boggy land, peatland, which has low potential in terms of grazing land. It's land that cannot be improved. Nonetheless, I think that these above factors can offer opportunities. For example, we know that deep peat can be a good store, a good carbon store. Now, of course, we hear very often in Wales of attempts to restore peatland. Now, if we return to the physical attributes of soils, now these tie in with the chemical characteristics of soil, and this is when things become ever more complex, and even more things for farmers to consider when they choose how to manage their land appropriately. And when I'm referring to the chemical characteristics, I'm thinking of the pH of the soils. We have soils that are quite acidic here in Wales. And when we talk about mountainous land, we also have soils that vary greatly in terms of their organic matter and the nutrients in these soils. Now, there are challenges here, but also opportunities. There are good examples of where we have excellent organic matter content in these soils and opportunities to store carbon and so forth. And with targets, of course, in terms of dealing with climate change, for example, reducing carbon emissions by 2050 compared to the emissions back in 1990, I do believe that landscape of this nature has a very important role to play in terms of achieving these targets in the future. Of course, I've mentioned a number of upland and mountain systems, but of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of lowland soils, much less so than highland soils, but nonetheless, they're very important in terms of our food chain. here in Wales, and they tend to be farmed more intensively with more inputs, for example, arable systems that we have here in Wales. Moving on then very quickly to grassland. Well, here in Wales, we have a very suitable climate in which to grow grass. We have plenty of rain and occasionally sun, and these are favourable towards our land, livestock systems, because livestock produce quality protein, perhaps from land that could not be used more intensively for other purposes, for example, agriculture. Now, these are quite broad-ranging systems on the whole, which mean that perhaps this land doesn't necessarily compete well in terms of meeting other needs. But coming back to the topic of the specific session today, we have a large variety of species within our grasslands in Wales. Now, lowland systems in general are more likely to be reseeded. We introduce new species. There are a number of lowland systems based on permanent grasses. And also we hear on a daily basis about examples of systems that bring in more nutrients into the grass for various reasons in terms of production and for environmental reasons. Now, of course, in terms of upland and mountain grasses, they are far more varied, in my opinion. Of course, diversity between systems, of course, and I'm not going to go down the road of discussing overgrazing or lack of grazing. Now, this is a different topic we could be discussing, but I think, generally speaking, there's been an increase recently in people's understanding of the importance of managing grass carefully for production purposes, in terms of agriculture and its influence on the food chain, but also from an environmental point of view also. There's a lot of research being conducted into this recently, and once again, this brings us back to the whole purpose of the land and policies. So I think on this point, I would like to conclude my contribution. Prysor would like to bring everything together again. So yes, diversity brings about a number of opportunities and challenges in terms of soils and grasses here in Wales, and how this feeds back to the food chain. Thank you. Thank you, Nan. Again, a number of points that we'll be picking up on. May I encourage and invite people to ask questions in the chat function. There'll be an opportunity for the panel to answer your questions, and thank you, Nan. Yes, you elaborated on the variety we have, and I'd like to echo some of Glenda's points. There is no one farm or one system in Wales. Wales has a lot of diversity, and therein lies its strength. Now, we have Olwen now. Olwen farms in the Llanfrothen area, Fferm Llan. I've heard a number of students at Bangor University talking about Olwen and Fferm Llan over the years, because in North Westminster, Olwen, she receives a group of them every year as part of field work, as part of a model they are doing on food production. Now, Fferm Llan is a varied farm. It goes down to sea level, but also there's some considerable upland there. It's quite hardy landscape, difficult landscape to farm. Olwen has diversified somewhat. She has sold meat in boxes for a number of years now, and she strongly believes in the importance of her customers buying the story behind the product, in addition to the excellent meat itself. Of course, she farms in a way in which ties in farming and the environment. So Olwen, over to you. Thank you, Prysor. I have to say that what Non has been talking about, and Glenda, well, what I have to say also touches upon this. I've decided to talk about the background of the farm and some information about the farm that shows you how things have changed over the years. I'm a third generation farming here. My grandparents, my father moved here in 1949. At that time, farming still used horses on the farms, and tractors were first introduced at that time. This was a dairy farm with a small flock of sheep. They had grazing rights on a Olwen, which had now been lost. Calves were fed with a bucket and sold to the meat market. Now we have 120, well, it was a 120-acre farm at that time. The farm was taken over by my father following my grandfather's retirement, and then I was given the opportunity to take over the farm after my brother found employment outside the farm. The farm is now 180 acres. Julian, my husband, and myself have owned the farm for over 25 years now, and we've changed our style of farming and the number of animals kept here. We have taken the time to change the breeds of the sheep and cattle in order for them to live more easily on the land here, and the land produces enough for them to live off in the summer and winter. And hopefully we don't have to buy in too many foodstuffs. Now, it is a beef and sheep farm now. It was solely beef when we took over the farm. Myself and Julian introduced a flock of some 30 sheep subsequently, and now it's increased to 70 breeding ewes. We tried to increase the number to 100, but we had fewer twins, and the ewes needed more food, so lower value for each sheep, medicine costs, sheep in worse conditions. So we give the twins some more foodstuffs after scanning in the spring. When we took over the farm, we had 30 cows, so an annual number of 75 cattle, so which was far too high. Now we have between 15 and 18 breeding cattle, so 45 animals per year on the farm. The breeds have changed during this time from Hereford or Shorthorn to pure beef breeds, Welsh Blacks, and then more recently some Scottish Highland cattle, some Belted Galloways, and we've been able to buy white Welsh cattle, and we cross the black cattle with Aberdeen Angus as the first calf. The bull is an AI bull, but we had to switch from the Shorthorn cross because they couldn't deal with some of the mineral deficiencies on the farm. Lime levels are very low on the farm, and copper is also locked in the land. We have tested the silage, and we have a mineral that is suitable for the farm, and we have to give the cattle a copper bolus twice a year to keep them healthy, and the sheep are given a little sway back at times. Bag fertilizers was used when we took over, and this made our magnesium deficiency worse. It locked it in the land. And then veterinary costs were great at the time. When we had too many cattle, we had to buy in winter foodstuffs, and the land was under strain. There was overgrazing, and it wasn't a nice way of farming. The farm has taken part in a couple of schemes, organic and tir gofal schemes, due to a very wise and flexible field officer who worked well with tir gofal. The farm and the environment and the biodiversity had improved greatly. I have to say this. It's a shame that those who create the schemes aren't willing to learn for the future. These plans were taken over by the government, and the ability to be flexible had ended, and the scheme was based solely on dates, contrary to nature and the environment. It had changed. It was a very good scheme, and it became, well, an obsolete scheme. Now, Glastir was the next scheme, and it was bound by unrealistic dates. It was exactly the same amount of land as the tir gofal scheme. So no wonder that farmers between 100 and 120 acres could not consider the scheme at all, especially if they wanted to farm seriously. This is why Glastir was not considered at all as a proper option for the farm. We just decided not to go into it, and organic had ended by then. At this time, I took on the work of taxing disabled children to the school 4 weeks per year. Though it wasn't much money, it was still a greater payment than the scheme that was supposed to save the world without these strict rules. So I was allowed to farm. The best thing about not joining was the fact that we had the right to cut the grass in accordance with the sun and not in accordance with an utterly unrealistic date. Throughout our time managing the farm, we've moved more towards regenerative agriculture, which is possibly a step further than sustainable farming or agriculture. Personally, I think that farming should be going into this direction. The idea is really going to frighten a lot of people. The standard of the land in Llan has improved greatly. We are able to top in accordance with the weather and not in accordance with specific dates. That's wholly inappropriate. Using lime and farmyard manure as fertilizer where needed. Using suitable breeds for the farm. And also sowing seeds. If we were ever short of clover or something like that, we would just scatter the seeds and things. This has greatly improved the quality of the land. Well, soil, again, this is an issue. Soil is the source of fertility for all farms, the basis of farming, and the environment and biodiversity. Now, we have tested the soil recently, and the worst soil we had by far was a field we purchased some 4 years ago that had been part of a long-term environmental scheme, and that land was completely dead, and there was hardly any growth in it. After 4 years, it started to show life, and the standard has started to improve. Now, we use bag fertilizers very often, and heavy stocking, and all under the pressure exerted on us by supermarkets and governmental policies that play into their hands. Now, the needs in terms of climate change all seem to be good ideas on paper, but the reality of implementing this at grassroots level, this is a step that people aren't willing to take seriously. Now, the government is reluctant to take the step, though it's all down on paper that they're willing to do so. The grass has changed from being ryegrass in my father's period to old-fashioned grass and more herbs. This has happened partially because we have had yellow rattle on our land. In the first season, the number of bales went from 80 to 30. We had to cut and bale everywhere possible to have enough food for the winter. Thank goodness we have indigenous breeds here. They survived the winter looking fine, but our silage wasn't of a very high standard. The following year, we had grass such as Yorkshire fog in most cases. The only problem with the Yorkshire fog is the fact that it's 70% as good as ryegrass. For indigenous breeds, it suits them without having to buy in expensive grass from afar. This is no problem to me. We have produced silage from the growth that we have, so it's entirely dependent on the weather. We make hay if it's handy, but if the weather doesn't permit, we make silage. But since we're not part of any scheme, we can do things in accordance with the weather, which is so important at sea level, deep peatland. You have to work with the weather. Herbs have increased in number. They provide different nutrients to everything. Every farm had a field for animals that weren't very good in the past. So joint grazing with other sheep has improved the quality of the land. And the reeds are used beneath the cattle in the winter for bedding and then turned into a heap indoors to be composted before it's used as fertilizer. The cattle are sold as young stores, breeding heifers, and then beef boxes. Sheep are sold as stores, and they are also part of the meat boxes. It's very nice to produce the meat boxes because people enjoy the taste. They enjoy knowing where everything has come from. When I was driving the taxis, and I've started to drive taxis, the land on our farm cannot deal with glasssteer. The rules are utterly inappropriate for a small farm, though there's a wide range of conservation and animals. The farm has a lot of what it needs, but it's not big enough. That's the problem. So I drive taxis rather than taking on the Saving the World scheme. That is my diversification. It brings in a good salary, but in so doing, I get to talk to people who know nothing about farming. I have new customers. They gain an understanding about agriculture and the countryside. They learn Welsh. I always give them Welsh lessons. They order their beer in Welsh after they talk to me. But I think we need to look to all directions. In order to produce and sell, we need cooperation between nature, the farmer, and the customer. So what Glenda has said, the farm has to start to work more as a complete and whole ecosystem. Glenda is entirely right. It's not us as farmers who asked to take out the conservation aspect out of farming. They have to work in tandem. None talked about soil. Well, that is the very environment and the basis of the farm. Olwen, on that note, I think we have to conclude your contribution. It's very, very interesting. Thank you, Olwen. This is very, very interesting. And listening to you talking about adapting the environment and changing the breeds and grasses, very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Olwen. We'll move on to our final speaker, Teleri. Teleri is a rare thing. She's one of the newcomers to agriculture. There isn't enough of them, and it's great to be able to welcome a newcomer. Teleri has just taken over a 100-acre tenancy in Bethgelert. Prior to that, she was a tenant on the Llindys farm belonging to the National Trust, a 600-acre farm. She secured the farming conservation scholarship there. She's also involved with policy making in Wales. And of course, a lot is happening within this sphere at the moment and very relevant to our session today. She's also a part of the steering group for the Farming for the Benefit of Nature network. Now, I'm sure Teleri will explain a little more about her work and that of the network. Thank you, Teleri. Thank you, Prysor. Yes. I want to talk a bit about biodiversity and farming, but first of all, I just wanted to say then obviously, as with any industry, we need diversity of people within our businesses, and I'm quite often I'm asked to talk about being a woman in farming, and this is the very first panel I've ever been on where we've just had female contributors, so thank you so much to the organisers. Thank you, Eviona, for setting this up. It's so nice to have this experience. So I want to talk, well, I have a number of hats that I wear, but today I'm talking to you as a farmer. This is why, to be honest, I joined the NFFN Wales. With all due respect to the other speakers in the conference, but it's quite easy to talk about how farming and nature can work together in tandem, but it is completely different to make it work on the land, as it were, in real situations, and to make it work within business and within a family context. And as Olwen mentioned, on the land that you have and various landscapes that you might have. I also want to mention there are lots of things that Olwen talked about where we find out that farming in conjunction with nature can really work for the business. On a positive side, it's great to see how Olwen has been able to work with her system, and something that NFFF Cymru have been working on is on the principle of less is more. This deals with how, if we work with the land that we have, can work better for the business. So it's important for you to identify how your farm can produce without that many inputs. And this can work much better for your farm and for the business, but also for nature. We've all tried to compete with each other by adding more and more and more inputs, and this can be a very effective way to increase your production, but it can also be very wasteful for our business in terms of finances, but also for the environment. So one example, fertilizer. It's much better for us financially if we don't have to buy things in that have to be put on the land. It's important to make sure that the land gets what it needs, but also we need to make sure that it's not given too much, because once you have an excess of anything on the land, it can run away and it can affect our soils and water in a negative way. So I think it's important to look at the way in which the farm can work. Chris Clark talks about maximal sustainable output. So trying to look at what your farm can produce without having to have that many inputs. Now, it's important that we keep people on our land, exactly as Glenda was mentioning. as farmers are those who know the land best. They know how to make these different plans and schemes work on their own farms. It's important for us to have that local, historical, practical knowledge, and to lose this from the land. Well, we cannot make nature count unless we include those who know the land best. And this is where I'm now wearing my policy hat, and this is where policies are so vital at the moment. We know, well, in fact, last week, that the Agriculture Bill has come to an end, and we just found out that the government is not willing to include food standards and welfare standards and enshrine them in law. And it's so important that we protect these standards. There's no point talking about trying to create more farms for the benefit of nature if we still have to compete with a global market. And at the same time, we're trying to compete with the global market, and there is a lot of uncertainty around Brexit and in terms of the various trade deals that will come to the fore. And there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the scheme under which we'll have to farm and where the money is going to come from. We know that the basic payment will be reduced, so we need to know where the money is going to come from that will support this type of farming. On the positive side of things, I find myself, I'm obviously biased, I farm beef and sheep, but I see myself and the way in which farming in conjunction with these animals and the landscape can be of huge benefit to biodiversity. It's not extremely difficult to create fields that are full of seeds and flowers, places that are grazed a little more, places that are grazed a little less, trees within the farming farming landscape and scrub. This works within the farming system. It's not subtly different. What I'm worried about is that if these pressures continue for small family farms in Wales, if we have to compete against large farms globally, and if food from a lower standard will come into the UK, I do not see how it's possible for us to farm this way whilst also competing with them. And also this way of competing means that farms will have to specialize. Farms have done an excellent job. They have been very effective, but this, of course, doesn't create biodiversity. So large-scale intensive farms are great in terms of food production and what they do, but not in terms of nature. And also, by making farms bigger and bigger, more intensive, you usually also lose the people and small families from the land, and also you lose that knowledge of the land. So I think, there are a lot of easy wins for farms to have more nature on the farms. There are a lot of things that make sense in terms of business, but we need to have plans in place that work for farms, that work for nature, and that protect Welsh family farms. Thank you, Prysor. So very pertinent messages there, and yes, I'm the only man amidst all the women here today, which I feel somewhat strange about, but it is nice to have so many ladies here who are very passionate and also knowledgeable about this field, and all the best with your tenancy. So we have had some questions. Some have been included in the chat function already. I didn't say Olwen, but there is somebody on the Zoom who said they're happy to hear about the Welsh white cattle, and they look forward to hearing more about them on Thursday. Glenda, Non and Teleri, if you can just rejoin again. So the three of you really have talked about intensive farming and less intensive farming, and regenerative farming. Now, is there a place for intensive farming at all in modern Wales as we go forward? And moving to the post-Brexit world, if you can keep your responses quite brief, I'd like to hear all of your responses. So a brief response, please. Glenda first. Is there a place for intensive farming at all in Wales? Certainly. What I would always say is that every farm has something to offer us from a conservation point of view, and certainly we need all kinds of farms. Intensive farms with top-notch environmental management. Thank you, Glenda. Non, what do you think? Yes, I agree with Glenda there. I think that there is a place for all systems, and it's important to have a combination of systems. There's a place for intensive systems, of course, but we need to think about this in more detail, and they just need to be sustainable systems. Sustainable intensification is one recent notion. Olwen, you described what you've done. You've never been an intensive farmer, but you've taken a step back even further. You've adopted a more regenerative style of farming. Is there a place for intensive farms in Wales? You recognise the fact that, well, every farm is unique with its own features. Is there a place for intensive farming, Olwen? Olwen, you're on mute. Intensive farming needs to take place on a landscape that can deal with that. And as Glenda indicated, you need to be aware of the environment when you're doing this. So intensive farming in a situation where the land can deal with this, and on all farms, there will be places where the environment is going to be different to intensive farming. It will coexist, though some farmers are more likely to deal with this with greater ease. Thank you, Olwen. Teleri, your opinion? I have to agree with everyone, really. But also, I'd like to add that in terms of standards and competing, well, yes, there is a place for intensive farming, but not just intensive farming. That is my concern here, is the fact that if everybody must compete, then that is the only type of farm that will be left. And of course, as Non indicated, we need to make sure that intensive farming isn't detrimental to the environment. Thank you, all four of you. Now, there's a question in the chat function. There's been much discussion about growing different breeds of the same species, as it were, and the switch to indigenous species. But when we're talking about diversity here, should we be growing a greater diversity, a variety on our farms, and not just specialising in beef and sheep? Teleri, I'll ask you this question since you're still on the screen here. An interesting question, and I'm in a somewhat different position where now I've moved from a hill farm and I'm down at the bottom of it, as it were, and I have soil that could potentially be suitable to grow in different things. I have more sandy soil, certainly. And now, as Non mentioned, the thing is, the Welsh landscape will be far better suited to grass. And for somebody such as myself and my experiences, and in terms of money to set something up, it's less of a risk for me to set something up with beef, sheep that will suit the landscape. And I don't need that many machines, and I don't have to improve the land very rapidly. So yes, certainly something for me to consider in the future, but it has to suit the land. It has to suit Well, the skill set that one might have on the farm. Thank you, Teleri. Olwen, I have a question for you here now, and then I will ask a question more on policy of Non and Glenda. Olwen, you talked about the venture you have, which is obviously a successful one, the meat boxes, and the fact that people like the story behind it and how the meat is produced. But I'm sure, in truth, in the future, essentially it is supermarkets that will take most of the product from Welsh farms. I don't see things changing much very quickly. I'm sure there's a place for meat boxes, increasingly so, I'm sure, but we're talking about trading at a large scale. It would appear that supermarkets aren't going to disappear anytime soon. So how do we get supermarkets to take more heed of farmers and to award farmers who produce their meat and dairy products and do so in a way that's better for the environment? Well, this whole COVID pandemic has shown people that it's possible to have good food, and it's also had the desired effect, if you like, on supermarkets. The buyer has insisted on having British food and high quality food. And prior to this, the supermarket would stipulate to the customer what they wanted to eat. But during COVID, the customers told supermarkets what they are willing to buy. And this has been an eye-opener to some. Now they are starting to ask where their product comes from and how it's produced and whether it's detrimental to the environment, the way in which it's produced. If people have less money, they will possibly buy cheaper meat through the intensive systems that we've just been talking about. But there are lots of people who are willing to buy less for a higher price in the knowledge that it's come from a more favourable system, more favourable to the environment, closer to home. And this has been considered more so. It has been happening slowly, but COVID has really accelerated this. So there are small systems that have had a greater share of the market. Because of this, people have started to consider the standard of food. Thank you, Olwen. Do you think people are willing to pay more? And ultimately, supermarkets will realise this. Well, they've had to already realise this, and people are willing to pay for something that is of a high quality. Some people don't have the money. I am not arguing this, but there are some people who insist on having a higher quality product, but to eat it less often. Non and Glenda, you mentioned the plans that are afoot. They're being steered at the moment, if you like. But Glenda, you voiced some concern, in addition to Olwen and others indeed, about current schemes. Now, farming in accordance with the calendar rather than with the natural rhythms of their farm. Now, is there anything you would like to see, anything different you'd like to see in the next scheme? What would it be? Glenda first. Well, I know I'm banging on about this, but what is vital is that the farmer comes up with a scheme. Then you'll have a true focus on what is important on the farm. Obviously, the government will have to come up with the aim for the scheme, and that, I would imagine, would be to retain and grow biodiversity. From what I've seen thus far, the government is telling farmers what to do, and that is never going to work, is it? When you write the plan yourself, you have ownership of it, you're going to implement it as you see fit, and you will have greater enjoyment of it. Can I just interject, Glenda, and ask a somewhat provocative question? Is there a danger, it's a provocative question, I know, but is there a danger that farmers, if they write the scheme themselves, they won't be ambitious and they'll be writing things down that are easily achieved and they won't achieve that much at all? No, because in the background you will have you will understand what the payments will be for and how to reach that endpoint. They will write this. And I imagine all the government will need to do is to have a QA exercise. If they feel it's not been ambitious enough, then the scheme goes back to be revised. So I don't see there's a problem. And as in any area, if you give somebody responsibility, they will step up to the mark. And farmers need to assume this responsibility because thus far, they've been trained to sit back and do whatever the government tells them to do next. Well, that's no good. So lack of ownership of the scheme in terms of the farmer. Very interesting, Glenda, thank you. Non, what's your opinion? What would you like to see changing? We've been in a situation, well, in an unprecedented situation where there's so much change taking place at the same time. Non, what do you think? Well, I think I'd echo the point that's already been made, really, by Olwen. I think Olwen made the point. I think it's important that agricultural schemes in the future offer opportunities to everybody and afford farmers a level playing field. As we know, there is a variety of opinion, and Olwen has touched upon Glastir and the constraints and perhaps the challenges for some farmers there. And I think it is vital that there is an opportunity for all farms, as we've been discussing today. Now, there's so much diversity within our systems, and I think it is vital that all systems have a place to aim towards this, and to bear in mind and to remember the higher standards and the further influence that agriculture has on our communities here in Wales. We've talked about the economy and the environment today, but of course we have also the social aspect of things, cultural aspect, which is also very important in terms of our systems here in Wales. Thank you, Non. We are almost beaten by the clock. We will finish at bang on 11:30. Teleri, a point has been made. I'd like you to have the opportunity to respond. You say you have perhaps more sandy soil now that you've moved down to the tropics. You've moved to a lowland farm, and the challenge is, and you said, well, perhaps I'd be able to grow different things, but I'm not going to, type of thing, because there are costs. Perhaps you want to be more ambitious. So how would you respond to that? Yes, I'll just say, I didn't say never say, never say never, basically, to be completely honest, in terms of the specific farm. We need to do a lot of work before we are able to produce vegetables. The potential is there. And myself and my partner have perhaps talked about doing this in the future, but at the moment, even now, it's underwater, so it would not be ideal to grow vegetables there. And as you said, in terms of being a newcomer, I've not much money at the moment. I don't have that many machines, so I have to prioritize in a way how best I can make money off my land. And yes, to be completely honest, perhaps I don't have the skills or the money indeed to do this. But I would like to have the skills and the money. I'd love to have the money. Whoever wants to give me money, yes, please, I'll take it happily. But to be honest, I have attempted to grow vegetables in the past on various farms, And in terms of the financial side of things, it's not easy at all. So no method of farming is easy, but given my current situation and the farm here, before it has any sort of input, yes, I have to do what suits the farm. So you think you need to be practical in terms of the business aspect and capacity. So watch this space. Teleri might be growing all kinds of vegetables in the coming years. We'll see. So thank you. A question for Non. If you can answer briefly. So wearing your YFC hat, somebody has posed a question, how can we get greater diversity within the sector? Teleri is a newcomer, but how can we get more young people? What are the barriers at the moment? Well, I think that's a very good point, really. We are used to the traditional system, if you like, of generation to generation farming. Now, Teleri is a perfect example of a newcomer to the sector. In terms of working with young people, I firmly believe that there are far more opportunities now. I think this pandemic in itself has identified opportunities. I know here in Anglesey, Mentor Môn have established a service where young people who are interested in helping on farms have the opportunity to do so. That is just one example of opening the door to those who are interested in learning more and to work on farms. I'm also aware through my work that Farming Connect have a scheme that matches young people who are interested in working in the agricultural industry, but they might not have access to land at the moment, as the question suggests. So it's to build a bridge between the older generation who wants to pass on that farm, but it doesn't have somebody within the family to do so. So that is certainly an ever-developing area, and I'm very happy about this as somebody who is so involved with the YFC movement. But yes, certainly this is something that has even greater scope. Yes, there's a lot of work to do, certainly. Thank you, Non. Yes, I'm drawing on your experience with the young farmers movement and as part of your job. Well, we are almost beaten by the clock. There are a few further questions that have been posted, but perhaps there'll be an opportunity for you to answer the questions, panelists, in the chat function itself. Personally, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share the session, but it's been extremely interesting, and also thank you to the Farming for the Benefit of Nature network for funding the session, and thank you to the panelists. We have heard a large swathe of viewpoints and ideas, and we've dealt with the whole notion of diversity, be it people, or diversity within Wales, or diversity in terms of new policies, diversity within farming, and it's been very interesting. I'd like to thank them all, Glenda, Teleri, Olwen, and Non.